Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Geun-HYE. On today's program, tensions in the peninsula. Pyongyang announces new nuclear warhead tests in defiance of fresh international sanctions set this month. And new blood, we take a deep look into the booming world of mobile payments as Samsung Pay sets to dive into the Chinese market this month. We begin today's show in the Korean Peninsula. The DPRK says it will soon conduct a test fire of its nuclear warhead. This is seen as a response to the recent joint military drills by South Korea and the U.S., which has kicked off with a record number of American troops and military assets. Meanwhile, the U.S. implements new sanctions based on the UN-backed sanctions on Pyongyang.
Fresh threats from the DPRK. This time the country's leader, Kim Jong-un, has said it will soon conduct a test on its nuclear warhead and ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. South Korean President Park Geun-hye responded to the latest threats with a strong warning.
DPRK will lead itself to self-destruction if it does not change and continues to make excessive provocations and confrontation with the international community.
US President Barack Obama has also issued an executive order imposing new sanctions on the DPRK, which include measures from the UN Security Council sanctions this month. It plans to freeze DPRK government property in America and bans US exports and investment with the DPRK. Amid the heightened tensions, the DPRK sentenced an American student to 15 years of hard labor on Wednesday for severe crimes against the state. The latest threat from the DPRK came after the US-South Korea joint military drills this week. The drills, called Key Resolve and Foal Eagle, are annual events, but the drills are nearly twice as large as last year's. The maneuvers involve some 300,000 Korean forces, coupled with 17,000 US troops and a lot of US military hardware. The DPRK ambassador to the UN has filed a complaint to the Security Council, stating that the drills are a beheading operation aimed to remove the country's leadership. China has expressed concerns at the rising tensions and stressed the need for peace in the Korean Peninsula.
It is natural that there are some differences between neighbors, but as long as we treat each other with sincerity and seek settlements with diplomatic and peaceful means, we are fully capable of maintaining regional stability.
The road to finding common ground may be a long one, but with regional tensions intensifying, reaching a solution is, without doubt, increasingly urgent.
For more on the latest about the Korean Peninsula tensions, we are joined here in our Beijing studio, Mr. Geun-HYE, who is a senior fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. And also in Seoul, South Korea, we have Mr. Chang-Ming Lee, who is a non-resident senior associate in Carnegie's Asia program, also professor of international relations at Yonsei University. Meanwhile, joining us from Washington, D.C., we're having Ms. Sharon Squassoni, who's a director and senior fellow of the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to the three of you. First of all, what do you, Ms. Squassoni, make of the recent announcement from the DPRK side, North Korea, talking about a new nuclear test? What could that be? What could be the nature of it?
Well, that's a great question. There's really no way of knowing. I would say, though, that the last test, which Kim Jong-un said was of a hydrogen weapon, a thermonuclear weapon, most experts pretty much agree that it likely was not. So, you know, this is, like much of the rhetoric coming out of North Korea, posturing. Certainly, if they tested again, that would prompt another round of responses, not just from the US, but from allies, because it's increasingly risky or threatening for them to conduct these tests.
Mr. Yang from China, do you agree with what Ms. Squassoni said? The nature we do not know, and if there is, likely more tensions? sanctions?
Yes, we have no hard evidences to indicate the real nature of the nuclear test. However, any kind of new nuclear test will obviously make a new round of tensions escalation. Especially, I'm very concerned about it in short term. Many people say, oh, it's another rhetorical stress by saying new nuclear test. However, if you look at the record of the DPRK, I always say it this way. If they say something relating to launching war, don't care about that. Most of them are rhetoric. However, whenever they say some threatening word on capability of nuclear or missile, we have to pay special attention to what they said. So now that their top leader have said, they will have a new nuclear test, even combined with the delivery means, then we have to be careful to follow the situation that whether or not they will do something more dangerous, I will say yes.
Professor Lee, what is your brief judgment?
Well, I believe that Kim Jong-un, who is a leader of a very small country in terms of GDP, has conducted the fourth nuclear test. He has threatened to annihilate New York City through his hydrogen bomb, and he has threatened the South Koreans and the Americans and the Japanese. This is perhaps one of the world's biggest security threats, and I am very convinced that Kim Jong-un, in the not too distant future, will conduct a fifth nuclear test, as well as other long-range missile tests.
So here comes the question, Professor Lee. Let's begin once again from you. The message is already out. The question is, Mr. Kim might be sitting in Pyongyang quietly waiting for every side's response toward his remarks. What could be the response? Since you've already got sanctions initiated by the UN Security Council and being gradually implemented at this moment, what more can people do?
Well, you're absolutely right. But on the other hand, we have to understand that despite the fact that the UN and the US and the South Koreans and the Japanese and the EU have placed inordinate sanctions on North Korea, unfortunately, one of the biggest trading partners of the DPRK remains the PRC. And so we sincerely hope and believe that the Chinese must play a very crucial role in adopting UN sanctions and ensuring that the DPRK no longer threatens the rest of Northeast Asia by building more nuclear weapons. The role of China in making sure that this goes through is critical in my view.
I'll go to Mr. Yang a bit later, but may I just follow up briefly to you, Mr. Lee? Since the DPRK, in its latest rhetorics, was talking about the joint military exercise between Seoul and Washington, and it is even describing it, quote unquote, as a beheading operation. Of course, that's only coming from the DPRK ambassador to the UN. So is there anything, or should there be anything, between Seoul and Washington, or messages between Seoul and Washington being sent out now to Pyongyang?
Well, both President Park and President Obama have maintained, in my view, a very consistent line towards North Korea. That is, if they're willing to give up their nuclear weapons, as well as other weapons of mass destruction, we are always prepared, the US and South Korea, to go back to negotiations, go back to the six-party talks, and to normalize ties to the DPRK. And so the real issue here is North Korea must show sincerity that they want to denuclearize their weapons, and then we can talk with them over a range of issues.
I hate to say this, but Ms. Squassoni, but over the past few months, since the recent rounds of tests happened, we've seen all parties almost stick to their original rhetorics. I don't know whether, as a journalist, whether it is the way forward, or we are just being conservative about the current situation because we don't know a better solution. Ms. Squassoni, from your perspective, what could be done ahead, at least in a minor way even?
Is your question getting at how regional tensions are keeping the 5 of the 6 parties from uniting?
The question is, every party among the 6 parties, almost, have been sticking to their original talking points, which the other critical parties of a possible mechanism did not agree from the very beginning. So the question is, as the tension possibly escalating, at least from DPRK side, will others still do the same? Is that the wise things to do? Or there has to be even bigger pressure, heavier weight, or rather less, or seeking some kind of third channel in order to achieve something? Ms. Guasoni.
So I think what you really need to keep in mind is that there's a short-term gain and a long-term game. So the short-term objective is really to avoid a crisis, to avoid some kind of inadvertent escalation. For example, during these exercises that South Korea and the U.S. are conducting, not to raise the perception of risk to a level where the North Koreans really freak out and start to take some military action. The longer term game, this is such a complicated issue that we've been dealing with 20 years. One of the questions is, does the U.S. say to North Korea, which is one of its demands, yes, okay, we'll sit down with you and talk about a peace treaty before you give us your nuclear weapons? I'm sympathetic to the view that a lot of what we've been doing over time hasn't really worked, at least not with this leader. So I think we do have to be creative. On the other hand, in our recent diplomatic endeavors with North Korea, they haven't really budged a whole lot.
Right.
So they really have to be willing to give something up. As Chung-min said, they have to show some kind of willingness to negotiate.
What about from the Chinese side? Mr. Yang, this is not the first time, not the second time, not the third time that I asked you this question. Also, with the concern from the other parties involved in the discussion, China has always been considered as someone who has much closer relationship with North Korea, rather. And there is a traditional friendship. The Chinese foreign minister even talked about that in the recent annual press conference, but he also talked about that is based on the fact any help China provides to DPRK is to help its people to better its life, rather than being used into any other means. China also joined the UN Security Council in pushing forward this sanction, but now China has been talking very intensely about a balance between sanction and negotiation, at least some kinds of dialogue. Is that wishful thinking?
Well, it's ideal thinking, quite difficult to bring about. However, we have no any other more feasible ways. So that is the reality. And I share with our Washington colleagues way of thinking, say, the short-term game, short-term goal and the long-term goal, say, managing the current crisis and achieving our shared goal, say denuclearization. These are the different matters. On the current matter, I think the necessary pressures and the increasing necessary pressure are the must. And only on the enough pressures, then North Korea could reconsider their existing failed policies and their failed programs.
But from the North Korean side, the North Korean leader, Mr. Kim, was trying to send a message exactly going opposite to what you have just said. He's trying to, in a way, saying we're not budging because of any UN sanctions. Even China joined the sanctions, but we are still not budging. We are going to test the next round, especially when the US and the South Korea are having such a large-scale military exercises near our border. So I think that's the message coming from Pyongyang. So is that going to be a vicious circle further ahead, or rather this is the time to talk about negotiation?
Well, in short term, no way for negotiation, no way for North Korea to show our South Korean colleagues say, show your sincerity about giving up the nuclear arsenal. So short term. However, in long term, the situation, the reality will make increasing pressures to force the Pyongyang regime reconsider their policies. So you mentioned, they want to go ahead is one matter, but whether or not they can is another matter.
Right. Okay.
So that's the challenge question to Pyongyang.
All right, Professor Lee. Yes, indeed. For Seoul, it's more complicated matter than all the others because you're on the same Korean Peninsula. Meanwhile, we have also seen Seoul's policy toward DPRK across the border have been changing and varied at different times, sometimes much closer, talking about sunshine policy, sometimes much cooler because of realities. So, Professor, despite of the domestic political pressure, for a responsible leader from South Korea, looking at the long term as being mentioned by Ms. Kwasoni earlier, what do you think could be some of the sensible steps on the surface or beneath the surface to be done?
Well, the reality is over the last 25 years, all Korean governments, both left or more right or more center, have tried various policy options. But the key issue here is this. As long as you have that type of regime in Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un will never give up his nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapons are closely tied to the nature of the North Korean regime. And so we've tried everything. We've tried engagement, we've tried sanctions, we've tried hardline policies. And so the key issue here is patience. The Chinese, the Americans, us, the South Koreans, and the Japanese have a critically shared goal, which is nobody wants war. We want a peaceful transformation. And the long-term goal is this. We want a unified Korea that is not a threat to any of our neighbors, and a unified Korea that can work well with all the great powers. And in my personal view, that can only happen if you don't have the current regime in North Korea.
That's I have to say, Professor Lee, the really long-term goal from your perspective, at least. But Ms. Kwasoni, we've seen at the recent annual press conference given by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, there's one sentence in his remarks toward the DPRK issue. He mentioned about a flexibility of mechanism. He talked about 3-party talks, 4-party talks, 5-party talks, or 6-party talks. That seemed to be, some suggest, a difference in terms of what his official remarks was many times before. So how much do you think these kind of flexibility in attitude could help us at least to start something, or at least to start thinking about something?
Well, I'm not so sure the issue of how many parties engage with North Korea is the thing that's holding up the negotiations. So it's really North Korea.
No, I mean, Ms. Kwasoni, let's just face it. Yes,
the
the thing that's holding the negotiations or not is about the sequence of events, right? Whether North Korea wants to give up its nuclear weapon or vis-a-vis it should, in a way, ask the U.S. To have a peace treaty. But that is almost a deadlock over there. So let's just put this deadlock a little bit away before we handle it. And let's talk about what could be some of the little bitty minor steps that we can take. Would that be an idea? Or what other ideas could we have?
Well, sure, I'm all for flexibility.
I'm sure you are. You've been working on this issue so many years.
Yeah, and I'd like to see some progress. That would be helpful. It's a very delicate diplomatic dance, right? Because Japan has certain equities, South Korea has certain equities, China has certain equities, and the U.S. does too. So even though North Korea, in terms of its nuclear weapons capability, that those are really quite directed towards the United States, and so they might, it might be useful for us to negotiate first from our perspective. I think in some respects we should take what we can get in terms of an opening, because one of the problems right now is that we don't have any dialogue with North Korean leaders. We really can't tell what's going on with this rhetoric. I mean, we have experts and we do analyses of How many times bombastic rhetoric has been issued after, UN Security Council resolutions. But, we really need to sit down, not just with Kim Jong-un, but the people who are surrounding him, who are the, make up the center of powers. Yeah, I'm for flexibility. I don't have any, you could go in a lot of different directions. Right. But the key thing from the other side, from our side, would be very close consultations with all the parties about what those maybe separate or smaller conversations are producing.
Professor Lee, could that be a possibility? What about so-called the parallel approach? On the one hand, working on the nuclear issue, on the other hand, work on the peace treaty as a final goal. Can those two going parallel with one another, or at least begin one so that the other also has the hope?
Well, our government's position is very, very clear. We also want a peace treaty to formally end the Korean War that occurred in 1950. But the key issue here is a peace treaty cannot come at the expense of no forward movement on the nuclear issue. So we must make real progress on the nuclear issue before a peace treaty is signed. And as Sharon remarked, one thing that I want to make sure to our listeners on the CCTV is this. When Kim Jong-un came into power 4 years ago, since then he has purged more than 100 top officials of his own party and generals. He has killed his uncle. He has killed his defense minister. He has killed his chief of general staff. And so if you have a regime that is killing off your top generals, who do you really trust and speak to? That's a key question that the Chinese and the Koreans, we simply don't have an answer.
Mr. Yang, we see different sides. They come in with different historic background and therefore look at things very differently when it comes to perspective. But the goal is the same, to have peace and stability in Korean Peninsula.
And the denuclearization. And
yes, indeed. But what about the very little step that we can begin with? Is there any hope for the little steps?
Well, actually, a multiple way of talks could be the stepstone for the baby steps, even smaller and bigger and bigger steps. For example, when we face more serious challenge from North Korean nuclear provocative new activities, then the other 5 parties can sit together to coordinate our policies towards the shared goal. Now the dilemma is all of our parties share the same goal. However, we have not coordinated policies. So 5-party, one of the functions for 5-party talks should be coordinating policies among the 5. Just now we have a few different views or way of thinking among our 3. So that the 5. So I think the 5-party could be coordinate the policies better, so that engage with North Korea more effectively, and also by the same token 4, 3, even 6. That's the baby step or starting point towards the diplomacy for the solution.
All right. The 5 countries in the 6-party talks besides DPRK should not only just working within the Security Council of the United Nations framework, but also creating something of their own in order to figure out what kind of cooperation and at least coordination can begin, at least for now. Thank you, all of you, for your wisdom and insights, providing us some inspirations and also reality check from your different perspectives. Really appreciate it. Changming Lee from South Korea, Sharon Squassony from the United States, and Yang-Yu from China. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. Turning up the heat, we dive into the world of mobile payments as Samsung Pay sets to launch in China this month. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. Apple launched already its payment service in China last month, and now Samsung Pay is set to launch in the mainland very soon. China's mobile payment market is emerging. Last year, 620 million people in China, or 90% of the nation's internet users, use smartphones to access the internet. With the development of mobile payment services, how will the arrival of Samsung Pay impact the market in China?
A new player in the field. Samsung will officially launch Samsung Pay in China later this month. via a partnership with China UnionPay. Users will soon be able to complete transactions by placing their smartphones close to near-field communication, or NFC, scanners at compatible sale terminals. Over the past month, we've seen Apple Pay and Huawei Pay enter the Chinese mainland. There are also reports that Xiaomi, ZTE and Lenovo are working on their own services as well. With Alipay and WeChat Pay already popular in China, the upcoming Samsung service will turn up the heat in an already hot mobile payment market. While some say they welcome the new mobile payment system, others are not so sure.
I would use Apple Pay because I use an iPhone a lot. It is more convenient and trendy. I'm a little concerned about security, but Apple is now a fashion statement for everyone.
Consumer trends influence me, but not quite yet for this one. WeChat and Alipay are convenient enough, so a new way of paying is just adding flowers to embroidery.
With UnionPay POS machines already dominating offline payments, people believe the partnership with Apple Pay and Samsung Pay will put more pressure on Alipay and WeChat Pay, which are not as commonly found in stores.
UnionPay is pushing deals with all the commercial banks, and at the same time, China's payment market has changed a lot.
With the Chinese mobile pay market already dominated by local internet giants, Alibaba and Tencent, which collectively control over 80% of the market, newer players such as Apple Pay and Samsung Pay are likely to face tough challenges breaking in.
For more on this, we are joined here in the Beijing studio, Mr. Jay Huang, who is a former managing director of Intel China. Now he's also investing in some of the interesting projects about innovation. So welcome to our program. Meanwhile, joining us from New York, we have Mr. Max Wolf, professor of economics from the New School University of New York. Welcome to both of you. First of all, Professor Wolf, you're from the U.S. What do you think about the competition between Apple Pay and also Samsung Pay in your market?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. Great to be here. Look, we always welcome competition. We did have some competition. Apple Pay itself was deeply influenced and to some extent inspired partially by Google Wallet, which is now Android Pay. So we did have some competition. More is always better. Samsung's done something very interesting here. So they also have significant market share, not as high a percentage as they do in China. And Android is a little bit less than half, or about half the US market, as opposed to a much larger share it often is around the world. But what Samsung's done that's interesting, and we'll see how it fares in China, it's fared well here and in South Korea, is they don't really require you to use NFC. So Samsung Pay is NFC, or near field communication ready, but it also has something called MST. It can clone on the screen a magnetic strip, and so it can basically be a more ubiquitous form of payment. And historically, the more places you can use a new form of payment, the more likely you are willing to adopt it.
Mr. Huang, this is interesting because in the U.S. there might be more competition among different kinds of players in the market. However, in China, the amount of people that have been using these options are gigantic. And also, people jump on new things. Apple Pay, for example. I've been going to some of the delis around the corner. They only accept now Apple Pay. But whether that's typical or not is another question. The question is, what would this kind of competition mentioned by Professor Wolf mean for the Chinese market?
I think China's market is quite different. I think for the online payment, it's pretty much dominant by Alipay and Tencent Pay.
Those are Chinese ones, of course.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I doubted that this Apple Pay or Samsung Pay will have any significance for the users and that they have online payment. On the other hand, for the ordinary retail market, as you mentioned, this is going to have some impact because so far the Alipay and Tencent Pay do not have much of impact, and then for the retail side of it.
Will that be, though, the retail sector, significant in the overall picture?
It's still quite big, and although we know online payment, e-commerce is more and more popular in China, but this is beyond just the normal and retail and industry. For example, and I believe Apple Pay and Tencent Pay all use an NFC, the near field communication. The NFC can be extended beyond the retail. For example, you can go to like a bus or subway. You got an NFC, and you can use and then your smartphone as the payment. So instead of having a separate cards for the public transportation, you can imagine this may grow into other adjacent area as well.
That's very interesting. Professor Wolf, from the Chinese market, you see different kinds of adaptive innovation. This is very fast in China. But when it comes to original ideas, of course, North America and Japan is still the place to go. Having said that, though, what do you expect these kinds of payment on the smartphone system to evolve? How is it likely? What kind of potential does it really have, business model-wise, and also in terms of bringing in others as a platform?
Yeah, so I think we see enormous potential here, and I think that's true in South Korea, I think it's true in China, I think it's true in the US and Japan. I don't think it's, so I agree that it's a bit different in each place, but I don't think it's one country. The other area we haven't mentioned so far, which we should, is in-app purchases. And part of what everyone's fighting for is be the default payment system in your phone. Because while there's lots of e-commerce, most of that, the fastest area of growth there is what we sometimes call M, or mobile commerce, done on a mobile device, tablet or smartphone. And while there's lots of brick and mortar retail, we expect that will also perhaps lose market share to mobile commerce and e-commerce. Still big business, and the mobile part, native mobile, is huge, so in-app purchases will be huge. But I think that we also see real potential here. Partly, look, in the initial days, and still to some extent, Apple Pay is about making sure that you want to upgrade your iPhone and that you want an Apple phone, right? And it's another reason to keep you in that system.
Right.
For the foreseeable future and for now, 75+% of Apple's biggest in the world annual and quarterly sales numbers and profit numbers, both record breakers, come from basically two products: the phone and the sort of plus or larger screen model of phone. Anything and everything they can do to keep you in that ecosystem, they're going to do. Samsung is following that lead. Also, Samsung Pay, at least for now, probably not for long, but for now, only works on the newest high-end phones. But Samsung's trying to build a universal solution. Apple's trying to build another reason for you to buy an iPhone.
Right. That's an important point, Mr. Huang. It is not just the customer loyalty that we are talking about through the different kinds of new ways to serve the customers, but also you see the Apple's recent campaign go against the US government, FBI, in terms of so-called protecting the rights of its individual consumers. Having said that, though, will this kind of practices be sustainable in terms of guarantee customer loyalty? If one could do it, the other would do that as well, and therefore your so-called favorable position will lose overnight, will be lost overnight, rather.
You're absolutely right. And right now it looks like this NFC and also the Apple Pay or Samsung Pay is the way to keep customer loyal. But pretty soon, I'm pretty sure we can get a Huawei's phone, also have a Huawei Pay, and I think that the NFC will become a default features for every smartphone, at least for mid-layer to higher layer on the smartphones. Pretty soon, I imagine probably 90% of the smartphone all have NFC built in. So this is become a standard features. So this won't become like a major differentiator.
So if that is the case, Professor Wolf, for all of these investments and attention needs being created by the company on these specific characteristics, I guess they have to measure very well as to the short term and the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a sort of long term is, can we get people to adopt a technology that does something else for us that we couldn't do before? And let's remember something else. Whoever runs the payment processing system, whether that's Samsung or Huawei or Apple or anyone else that we've imagined so far and discussed or that we haven't, Google, what have, they also control the information. So they will know who buys what, when, where, and how. And that is incredibly powerful, incredibly valuable information, because I would have micro information on exactly what you buy and, by the way, what you pay for it at all times. That's hugely valuable. And the other thing we should mention is if people move away to cash, away from cash to these things, it also gives tax authorities and governments much deeper and much better information about what's going on and what their populations are doing.
But that's almost like credit card in a way. Would that have a much bigger impact of getting to know what the consumers' informations are? And consumers, if they don't want to, they can choose to pay cash or use other means so that their information would not be revealed to one specific service on the smartphone. And they could use various kinds of smartphones in order to pay for what they really want to pay if they don't want the record to be controlled by just one or two.
I mean, there are always many ways around any of these things, but one of the things that would be more information rich is most credit cards don't come with a locational tracking device. The app on your phone can tell me everywhere you went, every other app you opened, and potentially also every email you sent and received, every text message and every phone call. And credit cards generally don't have those kind of capabilities.
Mr. Huang, I've been always thinking about this for quite some time. Because every time when one new product come out on our smartphone or a big product pushed out by Apple or Samsung, the world's media seems to be so happy in jumping on it and do free promotion for it overnight. But I just wondered, how smart are we really by doing it? And also the public, how smart are we in terms of easily accepting one product pushed forward by these new tech giants? How much do we know about our rights before we are using it? And how much responsibility these giants should have and could have in terms of briefing their customers about what the rights are? Have we reached to this stage? Have we reached to this stage?
I think this is a convoluted questions. The first of all, I think is some of the features they push down. Some of them are successful. Some of them are not so successful. We understand that. I think this payment is going to be very popular. You're right in terms of consumer rights. That is, I think, a very big challenge, how to protect the consumers' rights. In particular, lots of services are free, offered. And then in return, the underlying statement is you got to sacrifice some of your secrecy, privacy, etc., in exchange for these free services.
But that was the underlying, it was not clearly stated.
Correct. And then I think maybe little bit exaggerating, I would say today, almost all those features offered to us, like default features, we have to be very, very careful. I would say almost all of them contains some abuse of their power. So we have to be very, very careful when we say select yes.
Yes, but you know, Professor Wolf, what can you do? I mean, all of them are doing that. They're not briefing our specific rights very clearly. And if you go from one to the other, despite the competition, they're doing the same. So are we being left with much choices, or actually we're being left with much fewer choices these days than we used to have?
Yeah, so it's a good point. There are many who do it, but there are also big and meaningful differences. So there's a gray scale here. There probably aren't white and black, you know, not the extremes, like you say, but there's a difference. Some companies are better custodians of data than others. And remember, not everything is malicious. Sometimes your biggest risk is incompetence. Sometimes people aren't so good at securing their data, and we have hacks and things like that.
Right.
So it's not always that the company intentionally misuses their data. They may also be irresponsible in terms of their securing of that data. That's an actual issue, and companies aren't the same there. And then the other area I would mention is, just because we have a pattern of some companies violating individuals' rights, maybe we don't need to throw our hands up and just walk away and decide our rights will be violated. We could try to change some of the corporate social responsibility practice, or have it even if voluntary standards. The last thing I would mention, the way I try to model and understand this stuff, is the following. Everybody has a currency they're not aware they have. If you're online and the product is free, that's because you're the product. And what's happening is you're buying things with your privacy. You're just not being told, and you're not being given a choice.
That's right.
I think we need to start telling people and give them a choice.
All right. Let me ask you about the choice question before we go very briefly from you, Professor Wolf. What would you choose? You know, Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, Alipay, Tencent Pay, or some of the Google products. Which one would you choose where you would just sit there and throw all of them away, pay your cash?
So I like cash. I think there's still a place for cash. I think it's actually a civil rights thing. We should keep cash. But I do use the other things as well. I use Apple Pay because I happen to randomly have an iPhone.
Right.
I like the other systems too. But I just circling back, there's always a small number of people who like all the gadgets because they love to play with them. These gadgets don't matter unless other people use them for convenience.
All right. What about you, Mr. Huang? Your civil rights or your convenience?
I think we live in China, right? For online payment, I'll go with Alipay or Tencent Pay.
The local
Actually,
ones.
the local ones for peer-to-peer is Tencent Pay. And then for the retail, it's depending on which kind of smartphone I'm using. If I'm using Apple phone, I'll follow the Apple Pay.
Well, you know, gentlemen, I don't want you to reveal too much of your private information to our audience from all over the world, but thank you so much for your advice on this regard. Jay Huang here in Beijing. I'm Max Wolf in New York. We appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us, where you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.